Morning, comrades. Sorry for the delay. A number of technical issues there. What's the running order? You want to go first?
I'm going to go
Okay,
first.
so we have the topic is transgender rights, justice, and social change with Roxy Hall and Mike Macnair. Mike Macnair to go first, and can we remind comrades phones on silent and off or out the window, please? Thank you very much.
Point. Okay. Trans rights, justice, and social change is our title. I start with the point, which I think is short but an important one, that this is actually an unhelpful title in ways which are politically important. Start with social, quote, social change. What we are in the midst of is a process of social change in the direction of reaction. The reassertion of traditional patriarchalism and national chauvinism. And the problem with it's the SWP has been running this front called "We Demand Change." But hey, what sort of change do we demand? Capitalism is not a target which stands still to be shot at. And what we're against, and the fact that we want change from what is not a useful political orientation. Secondly, rights and justice. I wouldn't wholly exclude the use of the terminology of rights, but it's basically within the framework of the liberalism which has been dominant in capitalist politics. Rights, claims of trumps which override democratic decision-making, Ronald Dworkin's rights from the 1970s, the, quote, human rights revolution of Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, again, late 1970s. Justice, why not equality? Why not liberation? Justice starts with commutative justice. This was mine, give it back to me. Sorry, corrective justice. This was mine, you took it, give it back to me. I had it first. Commutative justice, pay me a fair price for it. And then, quote, distributive justice, go back to Cicero, give to each his due. And Cicero's distributive justice is an argument against equality for the defense of the property rights of the ruling class. Okay, critiqued. Marx critiques commutative justice politics in Capital Vol. 1 against the Proudhonists and the left Ricardians. Distributive justice came back into politics with John Rawls' theory of justice, and again, it's a theory of the justification of, quote, the priority of liberty, that is the United States Constitution, and the, quote, difference principle, that is that inequality is justified insofar as it makes everybody better off. So this language of justice and rights and social change is politically misleading. Liberation is a better approach, the question of the liberation of trans people. In this, we have a common position with the RCO comrades who've written about queer liberation, and a common position with the Spartacist comrades who've written largely good, though I don't entirely agree with it, long article called Transgender Liberation, Liberal Betrayal and Marxist Answers. Second, I move on to it's inevitably very summary, the positive line which is expressed in the draft theses, which is my line and not CPGP's, because this is a draft produced which is under discussion. We discussed it at an aggregate in May 25th. There's been some E-list discussion. There's been some criticisms in the Weekly Workers' Letters page. It would be very welcome for comrades to write more criticisms or amendments, etc., actually in the paper, which is, in our view, the better way to have discussions. But nonetheless, this is not an adopted CPGB position. It's my draft. Starting point, there is a witch hunt, conservative witch hunt going on. This is not to be analysed as there is a crisis of gender relations as such. It's analogous to the Tsarist states witch hunt of the Skoptsi, who were a religious minority who self-castrated, which the Bolsheviks fought against the witch hunt of the Skoptsi in the 1900s through to the revolution. Or analogous to Nazi and modern witch hunting of Roma. Trans people are being targeted because they are a targetable minority for ulterior political purposes. And the ulterior political purposes is the active promotion of trad wives, surrendered wives, the traditional family relationships. And in this case, through the form of Genesis, male and female created he them. Within the Supreme Court judgment is the denial of the existence of intersex people there, and a whole load of stuff of that sort. It's not equivalent to the Jews as the minority who are the malign controllers. The malign controllers, the equivalent of the Jews in the modern far-right witch hunt, is guys who have degrees. And liberals in general. Trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the intelligentsia, as the French right wing argued it back in the interwar period. Step two, however, why does this witch hunt? Why does this witch hunt have political purchase? And the answer which I give in this draft is it has political purchase because of the same dynamics which produce queer bashing in general. And these dynamics, we start with the family is not a capitalist structure for disciplining the working class or for organising social reproduction. It's a social productive institution, which was actually the primary form of primary form of locus of production in feudalism. I'm not going to say the primary form of locus of production in classical antiquity, because although Roman law talked about the familia, the familia of Roman law includes all your slaves who you hold in barracks conditions, and not just low-level household production. But this social productive institution is one on which people are dependent for childcare. Pam, a couple of days ago, referred to doing childcare for grandchildren. For low-level healthcare, people rely on their partners to look after them when they're down with the flu or stuff like that. For low-level social care of the elderly. And the more the liberals attack state provision of welfare, by privatising health and education, by cutting welfare provisions in general, the more people are dependent on the family. It's also true the more they're dependent on charity. We headlined back when there was all the agitation, make poverty history. We rightly headlined, make charity history. A load of the left attacked us for negative treatment of the poverty lobby. The increased reliance on the family and increased reliance on charity naturally produces increased support for patriarchalism, traditionalist religion, and so on. Secondly, however, increased reliance on the family relates to the processes of family formation in capitalism. And the processes of family formation in capitalism move out of the arranged marriage system, which is characteristic of actually not only feudalism, but also classical antiquity, where the parents arrange marriages for their sons and daughters, and into market forms where you have what may be reasonably be called heterosexual cruising grounds. Institutions where people go to meet each other. And this market formation of families carries with it, just as the market generates commodity fetishism in general, the market formation of families carries with it the fetishistic performance of heterosexuality. And in that context, actually, I said the dynamics which drive queer bashing, queer bashing is a form of performance of heterosexual masculinity by people who are in a relatively weak position, finding somebody, and it's actually not that distinct in that sense from packy bashing, which now gets excused as, and is Muslim, calling it Islamophobia is excusing what's in reality just ordinary imperial racism. So queer bashing comes out of that, but actually it also comes out of it. Some of the gender critical feminism is not all of it, but some of the sort of gut reaction gender critical feminism is the compulsive or fetishistic performance of heterosexual femininity connected with the reproductive role, the fetishism of the maternal role, the fear of the next generation down, giving up on reproduction by having irrevocable changes to their bodies. Okay, then the consequence of these points, this creates the basis of hostility to gender nonconformity, and that it's that basis of hostility to gender nonconformity which is exploited by the far right. Including the far right here, the Tory party and the Republican Party and so on. And in fact, the guys who started this witch hunt, we know who started this witch hunt. They reported on it in interviews with a right-wing press. They came up with after the Black Lives Matter protests. It became apparent that it was problematic to use race as the center of Republican Party political campaigning. And they noticed that there was this fight over transgender in the women's movement, and picked up the gender critical feminists as an instrument of for entering wedge for Conservative Party politics more generally. However, the ground for it exists because of social processes in the capitalist market economy, in the capitalist economy as such. Okay, so then, in terms of political responses to this question, it's no good, and here I think we and the RCO comrades and the Spartacists all have common ground. It's no good to just say we go in behind the liberals And the particular British example of this was the dominant tendency among trans rights activists and among the left was to say, we accept Theresa May's proposals for gender recognition, which means that we are going to make gender recognition, transition recognition easier on a self-declaration basis. That was then, May dropped it, of course, because, well, May lost office, but May dropped it because it wasn't going anywhere. The Scottish National Party leadership came up with the idea, hey, this is May, therefore the Tories can't go after us on this question. Stupid parliamentary cretinism on the part of the SNP. But then the consequence of that, which goes along with it, is that it holds out campaigners for trans liberation as the allies of the human resources department, the human resources departments in the companies, of big capital, of liberalism. And moreover, because of the extent to which it involved a commitment to policing of names and no platforming of TERF/gender critical feminists, that presents itself as we back the state, we back central government control and so on and so forth, so that it sets up the conditions for that policy sets up the conditions for the anti-trans witch hunt. Okay, in that circumstance, communists have an obligation to fight the witch hunt and to pose alternative answers. It's not the job of communists to just follow on behind, to say we are with the oppressed and therefore we follow on behind the movement in its existing and disastrous political line. These draft theses formulate the question of what alternative lie in terms of separating the maximum program, which involves is communism, the supersession of the state, the withering away of the state, the supersession of the family, the abolition and overthrow of the class order altogether. And then we make the point that in relation to communism, the question of the underlying drivers which drive anti-trans, which drive queer bashing and so on and so forth, are taken away. And the second level is the level of the minimum program, and the minimum program is stuff which we could do right now, which a communist government, or I should say, a communist government of a European workers' federation could do right now, which is things like the immediate abolition of the requirement to have gender on your official documents, the immediate increase in the number of gender-neutral facilities of one sort or another, the radical reduction in the use of imprisonment as a criminal penalty, and so on and so on. And quite a lot of the things in the minimum program are common issues which we can present as relevant to trans people, but which are actually common. So employment discrimination, this is about the general regime of the capitalist class's control of hiring and firing, and its use of the control of hiring and firing as a method of division and control. The discrimination in housing. Yes, there's discrimination in housing, but radical increase in public housing provision and so on can affect that as much as formal anti-discrimination has been in place now for more than 20 years. And formal anti-discrimination in relation to women has been in place for now, 1974, 50 years. And has it reduced discrimination in housing employment? No, it hasn't. Then finally, and there are a series of issues of that sort in this draft. Then finally, there are some questions of theory, which I have put only to a very limited extent in the draft theses. It's necessary to reject, quote, intersectionality. It's necessary to reject intersectionality because what it leads to is people's frontism and the crowding in behind the liberals. And the upshot of it, we saw, in fact, I wrote on intersectionality as such some time ago, vote Clinton, get Trump. And it's the first Trump administration which gives you a radical conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and which therefore gives you, under the Biden administration, the overthrow of Roe and Wade. So that the idea of the intersectional coalition, which says we can't have the leading role of the working class, we have to have an intersectional coalition with the liberals, actually leads to the defeat, although it's justified on the grounds that the oppressed are not to be made to wait for the workers' revolution. Actually, it leads to the defeat of the oppressed. It leads to worse outcomes than the old priority of the working class. We need to reject Michel Foucault and all the derivatives of Michel Foucault, Judith Butler's work on gender and stuff like that. Basically because the argument, which was already present in Foucault, is the priority of ideology and of ideological discourses over material processes and over biology and the markets and economics and so on and so forth. That's already present. There's an interesting collection of essays, Foucault and neoliberalism. Foucault was actually part of the movement into neoliberalism in Eurocommunism in the 1970s. If you actually take that seriously, it logically necessarily follows, if you say that the subjective ideologies are dominant, actually what logically follows is the marginalist economists' claim that unemployment is caused by workers unreasonably refusing to accept below subsistence wages. Finally, limits of social reproduction theory. Social reproduction theory actually is part of the left of the 1970s desire to escape from the supposed vulgarization of Marx by Engels and to have a Marxism which doesn't involve historical materialism, but which derives all the phenomena of capitalism immediately out of the logics of capital as we can see them in Marx's Capital. Yeah. And it's not just social reproduction theory. There's a whole mass of literature which has been less popular with the left than social reproduction theory has been. The problem with it is precisely, as I said above, that it doesn't get the family right. You know, it makes the family and the family structure more critical to capitalist control than is in fact the case. And in consequence, it actually makes, it doesn't get, the capitalists are abandoning liberalism in favor of national patriarchalism. But in 10 years' time, they can reverse. If national patriarchalism becomes unpopular, they will abandon that in favor of liberalism. Both national patriarchalism and liberalism are naturally produced by capitalist society, and they can move to and fro between one and the other. And SRT, social reproduction theory, doesn't get that. Finally, again, theoretical questions. We say the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself. The left, since the 1970s, has tended to say on that basis, the emancipation of women is the task of women themselves. The emancipation of black people is the task of black people themselves. The emancipation of lesbians and gay men is the task of lesbians and gay men themselves. And now the emancipation of trans people is the task of trans people themselves. But this is delusive. It's already delusive in the context of the emancipation of women, in spite of the fact that women are actually the majority. It was sort of plausible when the Maoists said the emancipation of the peasantry is the task of the peasantry themselves, because the peasantry are an exploited class. So that if the peasantry go and burn down the manor house and kill the manorial lord, which was what the Maoists got them to do when they could, then that relationship of exploitation is gone. But in fact, the ability of the peasantry to do that was dependent on the Chinese Red Army, which, in spite of all representations about guerrillism, was a regular army with regular military supplies shipped out of the Soviet Union. And the emancipation of the peasantry is the task of the peasantry themselves is sort of, we get some of it again invisible again in what Mark Mulholland was talking about in terms of the Irish land. But where do you get from it is something much more limited, and that doesn't work. When we extend it to women whose position is precisely under patriarchal relations, one of atomization in the family household, it doesn't work. And a fortiori, when we extend it to national minorities, racial minorities, gender, sex and gender minorities, sexual and gender minorities, it doesn't work. It's illusory to imagine that the emancipation of trans people can be the task of trans people themselves. It needs the working class to overthrow the capitalist order for there to be a real perspective of emancipation. Secondly, quote, from periphery to centre. We imagined, and I say we because, I was part of this fucking movement, not the trans movement, but I was part of the radical gay movement in the 1970s. We imagined that because the roots of Sur les pavés, c'est la plage, it's the 1968 Situationist slogan. Just underneath the cobblestones is the beach. We imagined that the roots of the oppression were extremely superficial, and in consequence, the flip side of it, we imagined that the movement to overthrow oppression could take the form of, quote, from the periphery to the centre, that we start with. Robin Blackburn, it's Maoism, but transposed into the West. Robin Blackburn argued it in the International Marxist group, which I was a member of in the mid-70s. We start with women, lesbians and gay men, people in jail, racial minorities. We construct that, and that it's like the Maoists surrounding the city, and it rests on the same assumption, that is to say that the working class is dominated by reaction, and that we have to go from the periphery to the centre. Again, doesn't work. And this latest episode is the latest, this latest witch hunt is the latest demonstration of the fact from the periphery to the centre doesn't work. The orientation needs to be to the organised workers' movement, not to the working class as an abstract, pure working class which doesn't exist in the form of the organised workers' movement, but to the organised workers' movement. And I give just the example, lesbians and gays support the miners. Lesbians and gays support the miners transformed the politics of sexuality in the UK. It did so because the US State Department, the US security apparatus moved to anti-discrimination in response to the near destruction of the US Armed Forces by US Army by race in Vietnam. They turned to anti-discrimination. That's one element of it. So anti-discrimination became the agenda of the bourgeoisie, but it was also the case that the actual practical solidarity with the organized workers movement created the conditions for the organized workers movement to respond with practical solidarity with lesbians and gay men. And the same is true in relation to transgender, that a practical orientation to the workers' movement can make a profound difference to the politics of transgender. That's it.
Thanks very much for that useful introduction, Mike. Roxy, are you ready to tell us?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you for having me. And thank you to the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Central Committee for having me at Communist University. I'm very excited. Yes, and thank you for giving me a morning slot. Certainly preferable to my last Communist forum appearance, where it was, I think, 2 in the morning in Australia. So that is certainly, I definitely prefer the morning slot. Um, I just wanted to I've kind of got a few different notes and bits and pieces. I addressed the Communist Forum uh in the wake of the I believe actually in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling, or maybe it was just before that. Um I addressed the Communist Forum, and I think we had a very good discussion there. Um and I'm also in the midst of preparing a draft for Prometheus magazine on gay liberation and the sex question and democratic republicanism, which I've also got all my notes for that. And so I'm kind of in between these two projects. And so my thoughts are going to be kind of informed by all the reading I've been doing as part of this. And I think I just wanted to start by kind of picking up a few threads that Mike presented, because I think there's a bunch of really useful things there. I think that Mike is absolutely correct that we have to understand the contemporary trans panic of a witch hunt around trans people as being a factor of a few different phenomena. I think one of them is austerity. It's a factor of austerity because I think it is. So I think this is especially true in Britain, not just in the sense that people become more reliant on the family and thus more willing to embrace, pro-family politics. But also, I think, particularly within the women's movement, the sort of political discourse around trans issues is overwhelmingly oriented towards this idea that there is a scarcity of women's services, women's shelters, etc., and um, that this scarce and transgender women in particular are taking up spaces, oh, they're winning awards, they're doing this, that, and the other, they're taking up positions in sporting teams, etc., that could be held by quote unquote real women, etc. I think that this, I think it's quite important to note that this anti-trans witch hunt has been much more successful in Britain than it has been in countries like Australia and New Zealand, and even in Canada. All of these countries have experienced austerity and neoliberal restructuring, but none as deep and as thoroughgoing as Britain in under the period of the sort of since the Cameron government. That period of austerity really is unique in the Anglosphere. I think in the United States we see a sort of slightly different form of politics, because the what we see in the United States is a society in which the Christian lobby, for sort of particular historical reasons, is so strong that it plays a central role and is able to quite consciously intervene in politics in a way that doesn't exist in the same way in Britain and in Australia, though it, of course, it is present. I don't think any English speaking country, or sort of the white English speaking countries, have a politics as dominated by religion as the United States. I think that there's a whole at the same time, I agree with Mike about the anxieties around sexual relationships, the anxieties around sexual around marriage and around the family are also a huge part of what's motivating this contemporary political turn towards reaction. I think this is a large part of its popular base. Something that Mike and I probably disagree on is that I'm very influenced in my writing by psychoanalysis. I studied psychoanalysis at university, and I think that these kind of libidinal investments in things in these kind of like very fundamental um problems or these very sort of central anxieties around sex, around um, success, around death, around the family. These kinds of we should never underplay the how much stake, how much is at stake when these are being deployed. And I think that what we're seeing is a very potent form of sexual politics emerging on the right. The contemporary form of sexual politics that dominates liberal society, which is this kind of contractual, um, kind of post-sexual liberation, uh, corporatized, commodified, consumerist form of sexuality. Um, the world of Tinder and Instagram, etc. This rings hollow for many people. Um, And so there is a attempt to kind of reconstitute this idea of like, oh, if we could go back to a traditional sexual life, then I could have a beautiful wife who would be pregnant and living in a cottage somewhere, and me and I would be happy, etc. I think that the problem for the communist movement is exactly as Mike has put it, is that most socialists have more or less tailed the liberal state in putting forward a radical politics around sexuality and gender. I and there's also a minority. It's a minority, but it should be worth noting that these people do exist who then say, oh, well, we should stop tailing the liberals on sex and gender. We should tail the conservatives on sex and gender, which is why, this is the sort of stuff of Compact Magazine, these kinds of right-wing social democrats. Imagine such a thing exists. This is people who believe they've created um, some great innovation by inventing, sort of social democracy that's also conservative, which no one had thought of before 2020, obviously. Um, um, the I think that the sort of problems that we so yes, I think there's a huge problem with us tailing the liberal center because ultimately, um, Uh, not only do I think it leads to a political defeat, the dead end. It's a political defeat, a dead end for gay liberation. It's a political defeat, it's a dead end for trans liberation. But I also think that it doesn't answer the questions that trans, working class trans people, working class gay people, need answered. Um, it provides a very limited sort of defensive capacity, but in doing so undermines any independent capacity to organize um, as a section or as part of a broader workers' movement. So I really do think it's important that we organize. I really do think it's important that we struggle against this trend to ally with the liberal kind of establishment. I think that in Australia, we currently have a government. We have a Labour government. It's nowhere near as right wing as the Starmer government, but it's a sort of neoliberal party like government for the management of capital. And I think what's very interesting is that so much of the socialist movement is obsessed with a kind of what we would call a fight the right mentality. Um, where the central battle is always we have to fight the right, and that can be the street fascist, reactionary paramilitaries and gangs, or it could be, the right wing, the in our case the liberal National Party coalition, etc. But we're in a situation where that the main right wing party has been thoroughly smashed and routed politically, have seem to be a long way from coming into government anytime soon, because the Labour Party has this sweeping majority that, unlike in Britain, they don't seem intent on fumbling. And the dominant ideology is very explicitly this kind of progressive nationalism. It's like, well, progressive patriotism, where like a multicultural, diverse society, and we're going to protect that while, allowing for capital accumulation. I think that what really there's a real struggle in the left in the socialist movement to articulate an actual critique of that politics, because of so much of the left is fixated on this idea of well, we need to fight the right. We need to fight against the racists, the gay bashers, etc. That there is a struggle to articulate what is wrong with the kind of liberal, integrationist, anti-discrimination, formal equality, etc. that is promised by the liberal establishment. What most people end up kind of redounding to is a kind of, well, they're insincere about their kind of statements to this effect. But I don't think the multiculturalism of the Australian state is insincere. I think it's very sincere. I think it's a part of a strategy to manage the working class in the particular period of multiculturalism. Sorry, in the particular period of capital accumulation. So, what should Marxists do then? I think that understanding um, the trans issue as being part of a broader struggle for personal, social, and political freedoms is absolutely vital. Part of the struggle for sexual freedom is absolutely vital, not just for that, that percentage of the population who are not, sexually productive men and women, but also for everybody, including heterosexuals. I think that there is a need to, and that requires articulating a vision of the future and a vision of a program that can actually emancipate people, that can actually give them a life worth living and emancipate them from the kind of like narrow alleys of bourgeois life. I think it's also important that we articulate. This is something that I've come to agree with Mike with, in sort of engaging with his stuff, is that we need to articulate the struggles of trans people as being related to the struggles of broader layers of the working class, be that in housing, um, be that in work, be that in access to services, all of which are, various minority groups suffer particularly poorly under these structures, but ultimately the working class as a whole has an interest in advancing, housing and access to services and protection from discrimination and unemployment, but also in articulating, for example, the ability of trans people to access, medical care, the ability of trans people to access, be able to live their lives, um, sort of free of state and employer and family and church kind of meddling, is ultimately a freedom of for working people to not be, ground down and dominated by these kind of bureaucratic sort of middle class strata that hold on to these skills monopolies, etc. Be that doctors, be that state bureaucrats. These, this is a struggle for political and social freedom. And in articulating that, I think that we can win a far broader layer of people than those who are immediately concerned with the conditions of a relatively small part of the population. I think that um, let me just go look at my notes. I think that this struggle for sexual and personal freedom has a deep connection to the history of the radical Republican movement. Been reading the book Sexual Hegemony by Christopher Chitty, which is a great book, and I recommend people read it. Had my attention drawn to this pamphlet circulated in the immediate period following the French Revolution. Um, this pamphlet was entitled L'Enfant de Sodome, or Children of Sodom, from 1790, and it celebrated the a culture of sexual deviance that had flowered in Paris in the wake of the overthrow of the monarchy. Um, there is a um, uh, I mean, there's a wide there's a sort of an entire section dedicated to that in this book, which I do recommend people read. I think that there's, you know, a connection, has always been an intimate connection between the struggle for democracy and the struggle for social justice and the struggle for sexual freedom and personal freedom and the freedom to, you know, be oneself, whatever that may mean, um, and to self-determine in the sort of confused and winding way that people do. Um, I think that um, I think those are the main points I had. I have more that I could talk about, but I kind of wanted to do a bit more Q&A, so I might just leave it at that for now, and I can add more later if comrades feel it would be useful.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Roxy. I'm glad the time slot is a bit better for you this time. If we could see raised hands, so I've got one raised hand, two, three, four. If comrades could come up to the front again, and Roxy, if you can let us know if you can hear people when they're speaking, that'd be good. So Anne, if you can come up, please. Just here-ish, and Roxy, let us know if it's not good enough, and we'll try and be a bit closer. A bit closer than that. So the mic's here.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right.
Yeah.
I can hear everyone. I can hear it perfectly well. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks. So thank you, Mike and Roxy. So one question that I'm really not sure about is the relationship of the, I suppose really is trans woman question to women's rights in relation to right to choose. So in Ireland, where I live, the abortion rights campaign changed its slogan from women's right to choose to people's right to choose. And at the time, like I was critical of it because I thought, well, you know, the right of trans women, and I suppose also, yes, trans men, of course, to choose is marginal to the question as a whole and how it fits into the role of women in capitalist society. But then afterwards I thought, well, what does it matter? Does it matter? Does it matter that we know we're including trans people in the struggle for the right to choose? Does it mean by doing so that we're losing the you know, the core of the struggle? Because obviously it's a different thing in a way. I suppose, you know, I'm really not sure what I think about that question. In a way, I think really what the struggle for women's liberation should do is to not be narrow just about, you know, women who, you know, biologically women at birth, who remain in that same, you know, role in society, that retain that identity. And anyway, so I really just would like to know what you think of it. So in Ireland, the experience is different to Britain also. In Ireland, the trans issue is generally accepted. And in fact, trans people are not, within the left, are not seen as a problem. I don't think that there's any feminist organization that, you know, is opposed to trans women's rights, none that I'm aware of. And there are, like say for instance, in the Palestine Solidarity Movement in Cork, and I think also in Dublin, sometimes other groups have their marches afterwards, probably to pick up on what other people are already out for Palestine. And in Cork, the trans pride was very big, because lots of people joined in. And in fact, also the Connolly Youth Movement, which is a split from the Communist Party of Ireland, many of its members are trans people. So there are very many trans people on the left. So it's not there hasn't got the same divisive quality as it has here in Britain. And the right to identify is something which for a number of years now has been accepted by the state. And I agree it's limited because you have to choose whether you want to identify as a man or a woman. You're not given the opportunity to identify, you know, you have to have one of the prescribed genders. But even so, I still think that that's a good thing. I mean, obviously, if you had a choice, you wouldn't want to have to identify in such strict terms. But I feel that it's still useful for people. I know it's useful for people. Then the last thing is something you said, Roxy, about the, you know, far right on the streets and the left chasing the far right on the streets, and the national boundaries context of that. In Dublin recently, at a demo against the far right, we had many of these placards that had "Love Ireland, hate racism." It is just, you know, given that the Irish state is the one that is actually leading the way in deporting migrants and in stoking up the resentment against migrants, the idea that you would say that is just ridiculous. And also that you would suggest that this is somehow like a positive response to migrants, to antagonism towards migrants, is to, you know, to basically say that Ireland on its own can become a anti-racist entity or a pro-migrant entity. We've seen again and again that the existence of national boundaries will mean that people from outside are always a problem for the state. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne. Tina, next, please. And if everyone can mind the tripping hazard on the floor when they're walking up.
Good point. Yeah, I think it's right that in our approach as feminists, we focus on the actual solutions, you know, and recognizing, yes, there's a witch hunt and what you do practically about it, rather than, you know, how many, you know, the theoretical debates I think are important as well, but we should actually focus on the fighting the witch hunt. I think that at least that is a responsibility for communists to cohere clear statements around that while continuing to disagree over some of the theoretical issues. And it is interesting, is it, that I mean, I don't know about Ireland, but in Britain the left has gone one of two ways. So they either after the Supreme Court ruling, which is clearly part of the witch hunt, they either gone entirely follow the trans activists uncritically, the SWP case in point, you know, just we have to, you know, we have to basically just support trans activists, don't say anything about no platforming, don't say anything critical, etc. Just basically tail them and try to recruit to them, which is of course always the SWP's real agenda. And then of course the Communist Party of Britain, which I think possibly with the Workers' Party of Britain, not sure about them, but I think Galloway is also gone to tie in a different way. You know, the Supreme Court ruling has to be celebrated. It is, you know, it is cry for freedom, victory for freedom for women, that kind of bollocks. So they've gone either way, both of course tailing different strands of the state, what the state is doing. And I think there's been very little attempt to find a way in between in trying to say, you know, there is a witch hunt, we have to fight it. But that doesn't mean we have to be silent about some of the problems that that exist in the trans community and trans activists. And I think you know, Mike's theses are a good start, and I think we you know, will hopefully be discussing them some more very soon. They are, I find them a touch one-sided. I know why they are. I mean, you do mention the you know, the gender critical campaigns, which is tailing liberalism and is playing the role of useful idiot. You know, you can't open and I have to open them every day, Daily Mail, Telegraph, etc., without a article by a feminist who's attacking this or that trans activist, trans lobby, etc. We've got another thing today, J.K. Rowling's boycotting Marks and Spencer's, you know, big campaign. She's such a freedom fighter, isn't she? Because there's a trans worker offered, you know, a worker who works at Marks and Spencer offered to help a young girl picking a bra, and you know, the worker was trans. How dare they? We need to boycott Marks and Spencers now. I mean, this is, you know, absolutely clearly part of the witch hunt against trans people. And much of the left goes for it, you know, it's you know, there's no surveys or whatever, but it is almost split half and half, I suspect, you know, either following this line, the trans activists, or following the gender critical lobby, and you know, both basically, you know, following liberalism, supporting the state, different trends. So you know, we need to attack both, we need to criticize both those, and I think in your thesis you're concentrating mainly on the trans activists, and I think we could probably you know, without having to rewrite the whole thing, I think we can probably add a bit more to that, because they are, if anything, they are, I think that kind of gender critical lobby is acting in an even more reactionary way. On the other hand, you know, the question of no platforming critical voices, that is of course a huge problem for our, you know, the culture of the left, and we have to fight that tooth and nail, and following you know, tailing liberalism within that. So we are right to criticize them strongly, but also criticize the other side, I think, in a more, you know, I know it does, but a bit more, I think. At the beginning, when we had this trans debate, I think PCC comrades were arguing that we do not need to amend our minimum program at all, and I think that has moved. That's good. You know, I think our debate has led to a recognition that there are a few points there where the draft program does not cover, you know, that, and I quite agree, you know, housing, health, etc. These are all issues that are covered in the minimum program, and they do affect trans people in the way that they affect other people as well. So we don't want to start doubling up and talk about every single issue or every single campaign that's in the news, you know, but there are clearly, I think, some areas where trans people are under attack in a way that is very different to, you know, women generally, or you know, poor generally. And I think you've identified, you didn't identify it in your opening, but you did identify it in the thesis. It's just worthwhile, I think, talking about it while we're here. And that is, yes, definitely abolish the LGBT defense, panic defense. I think you mentioned that. I mean, that is something that could go into the minimum program. But also, as you mentioned, the abolition of the requirement to state sex on public documents. And I think that is actually the more important one, perhaps, because it you know, it points to our future. It points to a future where we don't have to force people into either or, male or female. But it also, I think, it contains within it a critique that so many trans activists feel they have to choose either or, that they feel that not just trans activists, trans people, you know, that they are perhaps having internalized the gender divide in bourgeois society, in today's society. You know, it's, you're either being a man, you have to be either a man or a woman, and I don't I don't want to live as a woman, so I have to become a man. You know, I think there's been sort of an internalization of that, having the two genders, and we all have to pick one or the other. Whereas I think it's probably much more natural, much more human, as we heard yesterday, to, you know, move from one to the other, depending on where you are in your life. And, you know, that you can be what you want to be. You don't have to choose yourself, or so you shouldn't have to be pressed by society, but also not by your own internalized idea of how gender works, etc. So it's perhaps, you know, for the human body, it's quite the operation, isn't it, to go through that. And no doubt there will be some people who really want that. Of course, we support that, but I think there's also a sort of push. You know, you have to choose either or, not just from the state, but also internalized. And I think to do away with the need of that unofficial documents is one way to say, you point to future, we say, you know, we can be gender fluid. You know, I don't like that term either, but, you know, you don't have to choose either or.
Thanks, Tina. So far I have Olaf and then Gabriel, I think, if comments, and then Jack.
Standing here because the cables.
All right.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna have them standing somewhere slightly
They
different.
have to put their mic.
Doesn't matter.
Or you do it from the back or whatever.
They can see Mike. I mean, they've seen him before.
They're talking away.
Olaf, do you
Away
wanna?
from the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we have cables.
Just stand here or?
Yeah.
Yeah, close as possible to this.
Okay, as possible. Okay, yeah, I was just gonna keep it short because Mike, you said about social reproduction theory that you disagreed with that. But which is of course interesting. But yeah, but also because for me, because in the communist platform and also in the vote in the RSP in the Netherlands, the whole social reproduction theory still counts generally as the orthodox and the right theory. So I was interested if you could expand on it a bit more, where your theory diverged from that, and how that also what consequences it also has for like the question of transliberation. Thank you.
Thanks, Olaf. Gabriel?
Okay, go there and I'll keep an eye on.
Yeah, you can just stand there so you can address the audience.
Just go there.
So Gabriel, Spartacus League. So I agreed with many aspects of what the two presenters said. I have one question and some critical remarks. First, to Mike, I was wondering what your specific criticisms of our perspective is. Now, yeah, in terms of what the presenter said, I think, as I said, I agree with a lot of what Mike said. I think our main kind of difference goes to our, I think, broader approach in terms of how do we towards politics. I think it's this focus on a minimum program, where I think it gives a bit of an abstract character to like what are the tasks of Marxists. For us, like the central task right now of Marxists towards the trans movement is really to try to orient it. How do you overcome the specific challenges it faces right now, the polarizations? How do you build real alliances with the working class in the current context? How do you understand the current tasks? I feel like just because I agree with a lot of the elements of analysis, but then I think it's the way it's presented. It's like, okay, here's the program we're going to do when we're in government. It kind of separates it from like what's the movement actually facing right now and what's holding it back. Because for us, that's really the function of Marxism, is to try to guide the struggle. And so, but I think that's a bit of a broader difference in the approach with the CPGB in general. In terms of what Roxy Hall said, I also agreed with many points. The one thing I think it's a bit of an oversimplification to reduce the backlash against trans people to austerity and to view the how visceral the reaction is in Britain to the austerity in Britain. I think you have to see the backlash against trans people more broadly in really the crisis of the whole liberal world system. And I think Australia right now is a bit of an interesting case. There's still the illusion in Australia that we can kind of keep going into this liberal kind of era. But Australia is really at the epicenter of the real global shocks that are coming, and it's going to be totally torn. The status quo in Australia is going to be totally torn to pieces from the growing conflict between China and the US. And I think we can expect that there's going to be some real sharp shifts in Australia as well in the same direction. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Gabriel. Jack? Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to remark also, Tina, on the left. I did find, I mean, I honestly thought the CPB, when they celebrated, was it the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
And this is a vindication of materialism. I just thought they've sort of lost the plot. I mean, this is a right wing, well, it's a bourgeois court in the middle of a reaction, and they're celebrating it. And I just thought, you know, I mean, even on the level of cynicism, you would have thought they would be more sensible when it came to their own internal regime. Surely there's some trans people inside the CPB. Maybe there's not any more, I don't know. But I just thought it was dumb that, hey, maybe we shouldn't use such words, but I just thought, yeah, that was my reaction. I certainly agree also, you know, if you take the SWP, I don't know, I mean, you can convince yourself, you know, that your latest line, you internalize it. But again, I do think they fall not into the opposite trap, and then we need to pursue a line in the middle. We need to pursue an independent line. I think Mike, you know, talked about an orientation to the working class and making this an issue that the working class champion. So I wouldn't myself describe it as some sort of middle course between celebrating the Supreme Court and the SWP's taoism. Just on the minimum programme, we've been in the middle of a debate about the length of our draft programme, and I'm well aware that there is always the temptation to expand it here and expand it there because of immediate questions. My own approach is, I'm not going to make a fetish of it, but my own approach is, just like the Labour Party, I know we don't. Actually, in our draft programme, we don't even mention, as far as I know, the Labour Party. I think we mention Labourism, so I know it has, but we don't deal with our strategy as regards the Labour Party. That's somewhere else, you know, in our theses on the Labour Party. And I'd much rather, you know, concentrate on Mike's thesis and critiquing it, adding to it, taking away from it. So you don't have to have everything in the draft programme. And it reminds me, Roxy, where's Roxy? Oh, there's Roxy, sorry. I was about to look up, there you are, thank you. I didn't know where she was. But anyway, it reminds me of your comrade, and I can't remember her name, Brunhilde. Is that right? I can't remember the rest of the name. Anyway, comrade Brunhilde basically looked at our draft programme and said, well, this doesn't sort my problem out. Well, the draft programme isn't there to sort every individual's problems out. But I do agree with Mike that if you actually look at it and say, you know, full medical treatment, for example, that isn't under the title of trans rights. It's everybody should have full medical treatment. Everyone should have housing. Everyone, you know, should have limits on hours, etc., etc. So, you know, as well as having trans rights, there's working class rights. Working class rights include all of the working class, not just the sort of stereotypical of old militant, which would have been male, you know, industrial, of a certain age and no one else. You know, women, they were sort of funny shaped workers. Homosexuals, this is a petty bourgeois diversion. This is real. This is not us making it up. That's actually what they said. Okay. I agree with the original Anne, actually, on your response to everyone's right to choose. Look, when I think you mentioned it, Gabriel, in Respect, they actually had a woman's right to choose. And remember that we put forward a woman's right to choose an abortion. And they changed it to a woman's right to choose, which what they meant by it, how they could interpret it, is to wear a scarf, right? Now, I'm not against a woman's right to wear a scarf, but given abortion rights was under attack, this was an appeasement of George Galloway. And this was moved by what the hell your old group called in those days? Anyway, resisting socialism, anti-capitalist resistance.
The Mandelites.
The Mandelites. The SWP all put up their hands for it. Shame on them. We had Lindsay German saying, don't make gay rights a shibboleth. In other words, let's give way on them. Well, what is that? You know, in other words, you know, we're principled communists until it comes to alliances. Well, you're not a principled communist, you're not a principled socialist, you're not principled. So we also had that debate in our own ranks, you know, about limits on hours. And in the majority's view, this was, women should be able to work, pregnant women, right, breastfeeding women should have no restrictions on their hours, right? And one, we oppose it with men. Of course, there should be you know, we want law enforcing that on the working class, right? But, you know, i.e., if you look at capital and all the arguments there. But what it denied is women's oppression. And we don't want to deny women's oppression. You know, it's a reverse image in that sense of the old militant thing that I've just been talking about. In other words, we see no difference between a breastfeeding woman or a woman who's 6 months pregnant and any average man, for example. We don't take that approach. And I think that approach would be wrong. And when comrades turn to us and say, well, you can't compete in the workforce, the whole point of working class politics, the political economy of the working class under capitalism is to restrict competition between workers, not add to it. We're not for equal competition, we're fighting competition between workers. That's another word for trade unions, i.e. combinations, the old-fashioned word. I think that you're wrong, Tina, to say theoretical issues. You know, let's leave it to Mike and Fancy. I think that's a mistake. I do think, you know, if you said, for example, oh, we just want to fight for higher wages, or we just want to fight against austerity, but forget capital, forget, you know, where surplus value comes from. What's the difference between Ricardo and Marx, or Marx and Adam Smith, all of that? I do think these things are important, because if you don't fight the theoretical battle, it will take you up actually strange avenues and into strange conclusions if you follow it logically. And if you reject theory, you know, what's your practice? It's blind. So I do think we need theory. If we want to be criticized for anything, and I would quite, you know, I put up my hand. I'm with Marcus Strong, who said that our position is underdeveloped. And I think Mike and myself would certainly accept that criticism. Just a couple of other points. Under primitive communism, we should be very aware that there's a very strict division between men and women, right? You do have fluidity, and it's precisely with women reversing, right? Playing the male, right? But for example, you know, they will play the male, and in that sense, didn't we have the image yesterday? I can't remember what sex it was, but holding a bow and arrow, right? There is a strong division of labour, but there's also, in that sense, reversing dominance. So Chris's theory is women assert their dominance, and then they give it away. Assert their dominance, give it away. But anyway, that's not a bit. I'm just saying that we need to look at what original communism or living communism, rather than thinking just whatever we want to think onto them. In terms of Gabriel and minimum program, this is just our specific debate. So I agree with you. As well as having a debate about our minimum program, should it be in the minimum program? Should it be in Mike's thesis? There is the practical struggle of the here and now, and we certainly wouldn't go with our draft program, our minimum section, and say, well, there's the answer. It's got answers in there, but clearly we need more. So yes, you're pushing there at an open door. And lastly, again, to agree with you, Gabriel, it wasn't that long ago. In fact, I think it was a year ago, having quoted Marcus Strong and praising him. A year ago, the comrade was here. He lives in Sydney. And he was here talking about AUKUS. And he was saying, we don't have any of this anti-Semitism equal, no, anti-Zionism equal anti-Semitism stuff. We don't have any of that in Australia. Well, lo, what a surprise. It's arrived in Australia, of course. And you're absolutely right. There is this sort of, well, we're different. It's not going to happen here, is it? Because we're Aussies or we're mates, isn't it? Mateism. It will happen in Australia. Yes, Marcus was definitely wrong on that one.
Thanks very much, Jack. So far, I've got one more in the room. Tam, if you want to come up. Any online?
A couple of Q&A, if you want to look at them.
Go to that.
On the people's right to choose, I've missed something. I don't know that debate, because I don't know what, as it sort of came up with Jack as well, that what are they trying to choose? What are people come back, but people's right to choose, and then it mentioned about scarves. So I don't know whether it was about the burqa or that in the past or that, but certainly seen in Scotland that the women, the feminists that were against the burqa because trying to supposedly free up Muslim women are often now the same feminists that are gender critical. And also then it does this idea about the right to choose. I thought that was really interesting what Mike came up to begin with. That it's not about rights, it's about equality. And then about access. That reversal dominance thing, I don't know where I'm saying that it's like as if it's rigid in original communism. There is a huge amount of fluidity and trans as well, but that idea of communism in motion being defined in such a way by giving and taking power within the community is it's a wonderful idea. With the YCL particularly, I think the YCL that had suddenly become a sort of force again, certainly in Scotland as well, to some extent. They were parading on marches the way that we used to do, information banners and with lots of megaphones. But their reaction, and I don't know if it's within the organisation that they have gender critics and viewpoints getting expressed for that, but it was very weird. Yeah, on what Gabriel was saying, that love your t-shirt by the way, that I don't think it's not abstract with the minimal programme because it is about demands for now. And I thought that's a really good example of with Tina, that saying that abolish sex definitions, the demands for that by the state, that seems to me then it solves the problem completely of what is coming from the other side of the whole thing about pronouns, which is just ludicrous that the trans community supposedly, you know, in solidarity with them, everybody having to express their pronoun, and it happens a lot in cultural areas, in theatre programs and all sorts, and on the first day of everybody gathering, you're supposed to define yourself. And I mean, and it just goes against completely the whole idea of there are more than just male and female as such. That it takes away the idea of any fluidity or that as well. And I'm sure it was a trap that was laid that was all part of this. What Mike said about being able to locate who started this. I think that the whole pronoun thing has come from them, and if it's not, at the very least, it plays completely into their hands, and it is then part of the no platform type of thing as well. I think that the thing is as well with Gabriel about saying that it's not about the UK. Well, it has happened in the UK much more than anywhere else, and there are reasons for it. And I think that it being towards austerity does seem to make sense in a way, because that you see in it, it's still so dominant. It's the Labour Party part of their programme as well, that is to continue this austerity. Okay, I'll finish there. Yeah, a big one.
Okay, thank you very much, Tam. Someone got the volume on.
Jerry's listening on his phone.
Okay, if there are any more in the room, we'll take them now, and then we'll finish with Roxy and Mike after the last in the room. So I can't remember your name. Can you come up with this?
Wilbur. Yes, Wilbur data. I'll say something on this a little bit. I thought I had wrote some notes, I didn't. I just want to add on the points that Tina and Jack were discussing in relation to the minimum program. Commons Platform in the Netherlands has a minimum program as well. It's obviously based on the program of the CPGB, or at least the program of the CPGB inspired our program. We had a very big discussion 4 years ago to actualize it, to really make it our program. And there in that discussion, there was a really big discussion on the inclusion of trans rights as well. And in the end, we did include multiple things that I've heard just now. Another one I would add is the ability to freely and without costs change your name, your legal name, as often as you want. But it's kind of related to gender identity or gender registration, sex registration. But in the end, we decided to include them. Like I said, it was 4 years ago, so I don't fully remember the arguments in favor of it anymore. But one of the things that I remember from it is in the end all about emancipation, but it is also about the relationship with authority. So this also indeed touches on other people who are not necessarily identifying as a transgender person, but it is about authority and your link with authority of the state, the Catholic state, but also the authority of the doctor. Just like, for example, just medical procedures, the need to have a diagnosis before you can go into transition, self-diagnosis, all this kind of stuff. This is like the authority that we want to break with. So that's why we, in the end, decided to include it. Finally, I just want to make a quick remark that stating your pronouns, I was very skeptical about this at the start myself as well. But in the end, it's just like about telling your name. But it does not mean you cannot change it. You're always free to change it. Like we said, you're free to change your name, free to change your sex registration. So if you are changing your own identity, and you can always, you're of course always free to tell your comrades or friends like, I'm starting to use these pronouns now. Can you please accept these from today?
Are you free not to use pronouns?
Of course, yeah. But then the question becomes, how should our people address you? Then you can just use them. Yeah, there are people that consist of always using their name or always using their name.
Okay, thanks very much, Wilbur, if that's the right name. Tina, do you want to come back?
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, I was gonna say something on the pronouns as well. I think, comrade is a much better pronoun, or, work, whatever. I think, I mean, I know why, it's part of the program of trans activists. I think if you're, with the witch hunt going on, I think if you're, constantly being called he when you're, you want to live as a woman is pretty horrible, that's a witch hunt, isn't it? That's a campaign of a witch hunt, but the answer I don't think necessarily lies into having more and more divided up, that's ID politics, isn't it? It's not, I don't want they, I want another pronoun, I want, it or whatever. So it could go into a totally different, but yeah, then we should reclaim it, comrade as a pronoun. So yeah, just to clarify on the theoretical, but yeah, I didn't mean we don't have theoretical arguments about it, but I forgot to put the last bit of what I was going to say is the argument we had with comrades from RS21 is about memberships, red lines, and I think that's where the issue arises, that they are putting up thought controls. It seems to me that you have to believe that you have to be on the side of the trans activists to join something like RS21. We've had discussions with them at the Manchester Day School. That is a red line for the comrades, that you have to be allowed to become a member of the future Communist Party, as you have to be on the side of the trans activists. And I think that is obviously the wrong approach. So we should have those debates in our organization, but not have them as a requirement for membership. People have all sorts of funny views, and I think through recruiting people, they should be against the witch hunt. That should be our kind of line, but we insist on that comrades should be against the witch hunt and not focus on that, but that theoretical discussions should of course continue, and we don't want reactionary people in our organizations, but they will join, so we have to persuade them through debate, through discussion, through education, rather than putting up red lines. You're a racist, you're a TERF, you can't come in, although there probably are things that we really wouldn't want in, but we should always try to convince by debate. Just in terms of the minimum program, I mean, I had more proposals as well, how to change the minimum program, where I thought it required, and the ability to change, as I've learned in the process, the ability to change a legal name in Britain is very easy. You can do it easily already, so there's no need for that, I think. But there are, as I say, I think there's still a couple of issues, and there are in Mike's theses on the gender, the need for you to put on your gender in official documents. I think that would be a very good addition, and a very short addition to the minimum program that I think we can cope with, as well as and that's actually Mikeism, abolish the LGBT panic defense, which I'm not 100% sure that needs to be in the minimum program or not, but for sure I think the abolition of the requirement to state sex on public documents is important, because as we talked about, it points to more as well. I think it points to what actually our program is when it comes to gender and those kind of things. That we shouldn't have to accept, the need to be forced into either or. And I'm quite agree. You're right on communist. Early communist society, where that is quite strict. They're playing with it, but then they go back to the old roles. I suspect in a future society it will be quite different, or perhaps not. Perhaps it's enough to play with roles on occasion as a future ritual, but perhaps people do want to change, and people wanted to change then, but it didn't even occur. But clearly we are where we are, and people want to change, from male to female. We shouldn't stop it, obviously, and the other way around, obviously.
Thanks, Tina. I've got one person who wants to come back in. If Anne, could you keep it quite brief, just so they have at least 10 minutes to come back?
So, firstly, it's a right to choose abortion, women's right to choose abortion, which was as I said, it was the abortion rights campaign. Maybe you didn't hear that. I'm not going to say any more on that because I'm looking forward to hearing you both come in. I don't think it's just I don't think it's an exactly straightforward question either. I think it's something that we need to think about, discuss, and theorize more, the relationship of that question to women's right to choose. Anyway, maybe I'm complicating it unduly. I think that when they changed it, the abortion rights campaign changed it to people, I think they did it really as an act of solidarity, rather than removing the issue from the struggle for women's emancipation. But anyway, and then on the pronouns, I think I just agree with Tina. I think, well, I don't agree with you on comrade. I don't agree with that whole, leveling it down to just comrade. I don't agree with that. I think that people should be able to describe themselves as what they want. And I think the whole thing with pronouns just really began with trans people and non-binary people saying, I want to be he or they, because they just get so pissed off of being called by like he or she when that's not what they identify as, and especially by old people like myself. I mean, there's a guy who, a woman at work was kind of, is now a woman, okay, has transitioned, and I kept getting confused. But because I think that came from a good place, the confusion, but we have to try and change ourselves and recognize that lots of young people don't have that problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I don't know what the running order would be best for. I was thinking, Roxy, and then you can finish.
Yeah.
Mike. Roxy,
Okay.
do you want to come back in?
Yeah, thanks, comrades. I've got a few things I wanted to respond to. Firstly, I think that I do agree that we should probably talk more about gender critical feminism. In fact, I could probably do an entire talk on it and its history. I think there's a whole bunch of dynamics there and the role of this group. I mean, while I agree that, the majority of sort of trans rights activists are liberals, I think that they're really not comparable to this other group that is, essentially made common cause with the far right to pursue their like narrow sectional obsession with with trans issues at the expense of all other women's rights questions, including calling for people to vote for the right, at the expense of abortion rights, etc. In terms of what has motivated this split, I think that there's many dynamics that have motivated it. I think that there's been a general trend in sections of the women's movement. This has been going on for some time, well before the trans debate was ignited contemporarily. Um, I think there's a lot of anxieties about younger women or the next generation not upholding the.
Is that us or is that no? Can you message him? It's probably her then. Well, shall we switch to Mike and then Roxy can come back in? Yeah. Okay. Do you want to go ahead? I mean, she won't hear what you have to say now, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay, a series of individual points, unfortunately, because it's a set of individual points that comrades have made. It's quite a lot of which are useful. In terms of the presence of the Christian lobby and the relationship with welfarism and so on and so forth, if you read Trotsky's Where is Britain Going from 1926, he talks about the absolute dominance of the Christian lobby in Britain. And quite clearly, correctly, in terms of the history, what got rid of the absolute dominance of the Christian lobby in Christian lobbies in Britain was the welfare state after 1945, the end of the old poor law, the creation of the NHS, the creation of the Butler Education Act and dominance of secular education. And in British politics, we are moving back into the ascendancy of the Christian lobby, and we can see that very clearly, actually, in the Supreme Court judgment, because it is precisely a Christianist, Christianist, the same way it talks about Islamist, meaning political Islamism. It is a political Christianist judgment. And that reflects the fact it's not simply that there have been cuts and austerity. The underlying extreme character of the situation in Britain, and this is essentially, I said this yesterday, Britain is bankrupt. The markets are essentially in the situation of somebody, the British government is essentially in the situation of somebody who's selling the furniture to pay the to pay for the groceries bill from week to week. That's what the deficit, the quarterly deficit after financial services income means. And I agree with comrades about Australia. Yeah. Jack's point about Marcus's point, he said, "Oh, we don't have the anti-Semitism campaign." Now you do have. Liberal integrationism, the essence of the point is people's frontism. And actually, it's people's frontism both for the element of the left who says, come in behind the liberals, and for the element of the left who say, come in behind the conservatives. Because why is the CPB going to come in behind the Conservatives? Actually, because the CPB's version of popular frontism since quite some time ago has been allied with the national bourgeoisie against the democratic bourgeoisie. And Brexit, that's the meaning of Brexit. Alliance with the national bourgeoisie against democratic bourgeoisie.
So Hegel might also counterfire.
Yes, counterfire, add also, actually, there's a debate in the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. There's a gender critical feminist opposition in the AWL. The AWL majority is back the Liberals. Surprise, surprise, that the AWL majority is back the Liberals. Context, how to fight, Tina, and this is also addressed to Gabriel. Yes, we have to fight this witch hunt, but the question is how to fight this witch hunt. And the how to fight this witch hunt, in my opinion at least, consists in posing an alternative which is capable of splitting open the contradictory relationship between there is a working class base for the witch hunt as well as an offensive of the higher parts of the bourgeoisie. And yes, that involves break with the Human Resources Department. Incidentally, my most recent usage of this, there's an editorial mistake. I wrote the HR department. The editors expanded it to the Human Rights Department rather than the Human Resources Department, that's okay. It's just correction. Political action. This is the essence. Why we say talk about governmental action, why we talk about legislative proposals and so on and so forth. This is Karl Marx to Friedrich Bolter in 1871. It's 1871 or 1872. There's the direct class struggle which arises in the form of the guerrilla struggle of the trade union movement over wages, conditions, terms, and so on and so forth. But the political action of the working class, the object is the overthrow of the capitalist state and the creation of working class state power. And But before that, the question is of the working class beginning to act as a class. And that means political action in the form of the struggle for general laws. Again, back to the 10-Hour Day Act. Marx's point, it's in capital, but it's again in the letter to Bolter. The working class becomes politically active when it runs a campaign for things like the 10-Hour Day Act. And going along with that, Marx says in his letter to Bolter, and we have to campaign for political independence from the liberals, from the conservatives, who will otherwise use the working class as a tail for their own politics. Yeah. So it's that reason why. Jack, the SWP, yes, the SWP, but incidentally, when the split took place, the Galloway ring of respect, which included the Muslim Association of Britain, went along and voted for a whole load of stuff which the SWP had voted down. The Popular Front is the Popular Front. It was already the case, actually, the Spanish Popular Front and the French Popular Front. The Popular Front is not a popular front with the bourgeoisie, but with a shadow of the bourgeoisie, which the Workers' Party clings to the shadow of the bourgeoisie in order to make itself, imagine it's making itself acceptable to the bourgeoisie. And in this case, it was the Popular Frontism of the SWP, rather than the actual demands of either Galloway or the Muslim Association of Britain in relation to politics, which were driving respect rightism. Primitive communism. Okay, primitive communism, but beyond primitive communism, we have got and we don't know, because we don't know, we go right back to hunter-gatherer society. The comrades are looking at large game the RAG comrades looking at large game hunter-gatherers, and they do have a sharp gender differentiation. But be cautious, because the Sarmatians in southern Ukraine, we've got loads of women buried with weapons. The same is in fact true in Scandinavia in the early history of but in the Viking period, we have women buried with weapons. Conversely, when people looked at in Siberia, in North America, we have what's used to be called Berdash, is now called Two-Spirit people, people in the position of shamans who are cross-gender identified. So these are societies which may be in transition to class from primitive hunter-gatherer society, but it may be because we don't know enough about what primitive hunter-gatherer society was like, of actual primitive hunter-gatherer society. Our knowledge of the anthropological knowledge is entirely about isolated pockets of people who have been driven out into the margins. It seems to me actually quite likely that these phenomena which we find in what are not so clearly primitive hunter-gatherer society were probably already there. I'm not going to go further than that, but I think it's important to be aware of that. And equally, it's important to be aware, there's been study in New Guinea of 5 different gender positions distinct from biological sex. In this case, I've moved to we've got on the chat Geoffrey Vernon argues that disorders of sexual development isn't correctly called intersex. This is the orthodox position of the right wing, and this is partly that they're in deep shit in a sense, because intersex people ran a campaign, because what we got was people who were not significant numbers of people who are not easily categorizable at birth. Leave aside the phenomenon castosemia, the androgen, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and all the other. There's a Caribbean place where there's a common phenomenon of people who change sex at puberty because of one or another of these, because of one of these developmental developments. The doctors in the United States and here in Australia and so on and so forth have been performing involuntary surgeries on infants to make them more clearly male or female. And there's the numbers is what are the numbers? There are at least twice as many as at the lowest estimation, twice as many as the global Romani population, as a percentage of population. At the higher end, it's more than trans people. It's the stuff where it doesn't involve, where something develops afterwards and it doesn't involve visible difficulty in deciding the sex of the baby. You're going up to 1.5% more. Which is more than the number of trans people in the more generous numbers in the census. So the argument that intersex people don't exist, it's really biological binary. It's just bullshit. And it's bullshit in the service of Genesis, male and female created them. We want to believe that God made us all perfect, and perfect is male and female in exact, define, and anything which isn't that is a disorder. If we go a bit further, I made the point, why people are desperately concerned about this stuff, what drives it is about physical reproduction. It's about fertility. And women get pregnant. Men implant sperm and women get pregnant. Women get pregnant and carry the infant for 9 months, and then actually, because women carry the infant for 9 months, that has knock-on consequences in terms of childcare. That there's a tendency, it's not an absolute law, people pretend it's an absolute, it's not. There's a tendency as a result of the fact that women have been off work for the first few months of pregnancy or and in the absolute first days for there to be discrimination, and then the discrimination results in that it's easier to make a living on the basis that the bloke goes out to work and the woman does the bulk of the childcare. It's not, this is just, okay, so then if we ask the question, male and female on this definition, it's actually only 85% of the population, because 15% of the population, although visibly male or visibly female, as the case may be, are infertile, just as much infertile as people who have had top surgery or bottom surgery. Well, bottom surgery in particular. So this argument that intersex is immaterial, it's not, the point is not that trans people are identical to intersex. It isn't. The point is that this argument for the radical gender binary, and you can have an Aristotelian definition, which Aristotle, either A or not A, and either A or not A can be said, X is a woman or not a woman. And this is a fixed, as opposed to the relationship of man and woman is a relationship, it's a binary, but it's a binary which is a dialectic as part of the social relations of reproduction and biological social relations, production and reproduction. In that context, it's a bimodal rather than a literal binary. That's just biology. This is why the doctor's immediate response to the UK Supreme Court's decision was, this is biologically illiterate. Change of legal name, and no, Tina made the point. It's no problem. As far as in a lot of jurisdictions, it would be right to have a change of legal name as part of the minimum program. There's no point in doing so in the UK because you just execute a deed poll and it costs nothing. You can download the form from the internet and you just sign it in the presence of a witness and that's it. More generally, I'm sure that this text is imperfect. I'm sure it is. I'm sure that there's things wrong with it. I'm not absolutely opposed to Tina's proposal in relation to. I don't think that abolish the transpanic defence is a program, general draft program element, because it's in the first place it's it's quite specific, and the second place it's actually quite possible that the courts will do away with it anyhow without us. It's right for us to put it in theses, but it's a sort of it's a significant thing. Finally, back to the US, the UK, and so on. I think comrades are mistaken if they think that this witch hunt is primarily is most effective in the UK. The reality is it's most effective in the United States. It's more in the United States that we're having trans men, trans women queer bashed to death. It's more in the United States that we're having butch lesbians arrested for going into women's toilets. We have had it in this country as well, but it's and it's in the United States. As I said in the opening, it's actually in the core of the political advisors, political operatives of the Republican Party that it's been introduced. So it's from the United States that it spreads outwards, as everything spreads outwards politically from the United States. That's it.
Thanks, Mike. We did start a bit late, so we will finish a bit late. Hope nobody's too starving. Roxy, we lost you quite early, so if you just want to start again, that'd be fine. Hopefully.
Oh, yes. Apologies, comrades. My internet went down. It's back now. So, I'll just quickly touch on what I was saying before, which is that I do think we need to do more of an examination of the role of gender critical feminism or anti-trans feminism or progressive transphobia, I think is another way of putting it, because not all these people are feminists, and certainly not all of them are radical feminists. But there's definitely quite a bit to be said on that. On trans issues and abortion and the right to choose stuff, I think it's just worth clarifying. I think that changing terminology around childbearing, it's really got nothing to do with transgender women, unless some modern miracle of science that I don't know about has occurred. It's really to do with transgender men and non-binary people who can and do seek abortions. Personally, I'm kind of ambivalent on this issue. I think that what is important is that we name that anti-abortion restrictions are targeted at women. When they are organized by this is about controlling women, the reactionary kind of block in politics. But it is also about controlling sexuality and um, controlling reproduction in general. So I do think it's directly related to the trans question. I think that on abortion and on trans issues, we should take the same position, which is that people should be able to self-determine. And when they are not able to self-determine, they cannot be free. I think that's pretty straightforward. But yes, I think that's worth clarifying. On gender recognition, I totally agree that we should oppose the gender recognition sort of regime. I think that tailing the sort of liberal section of the bourgeoisie on this is wrong. I think it's worth pointing out that if we're talking about sort of sexual conformism or gender conformism, there is no like den of gender conformism deeper than the regime that is imposed on trans people around accessing medical care. It was not all that long ago that in Australia, I don't know about elsewhere, you had to prove to a panel of doctors that you were, sufficiently feminine to qualify for cross-sex hormones, which could include making you walk, these psychologists making you walk around in high heels, etc. All sorts of humiliating and stupid practices. Um, if you are a person, like, for my own experience, when I first sought hormone therapy, I was told by friends, if you have some sort of complex, I feel more like a woman than a man, but do not express any of that to the doctor, because if you do not neatly fit into these categories, they will not accept it. They will just like kick you out. If you are, for example, there are some butch lesbians, for example, who take testosterone, whatever. Um, Something none of my business. If you are seeking that, for whatever reason, because it makes you feel better about yourself or whatever, you're going to have a very hard time in most medical jurisdictions, because these kinds of regimes are imposed on transgender people. They're certainly not the products of transgender people. Um, by the kind of sexological establishment. Um, I think that it's very important that we make that distinction. I think that there is an element of a sort of rational kernel of some of the gender critical feminist discourse is that certain forms of transgender discourse are somewhat sexually conformist or gender conformist, and we should be critical of that. But I think that this is in part a reflection of the fact that so much of this discourse is actually shaped by bourgeois sexology, these kind of psychological institutions, etc., which are very rigid and conservative, etc. And I really do think we need to point that out. Um, is there anything else? That I wanted to address. I mean, ultimately, I was invited to give commentary on Mike's draft thesis, and I haven't had time yet. I'm very busy. I'm probably going to be very busy through to January. But I'm definitely am interested in this discussion and ongoing discussion around how we address these questions programmatically in the whatever we want to call our little amongst our sympathetic sections of our little partyist trend. Um, I think that yeah, I somewhat agree. I think that the anti-trans panic in Britain and the anti-trans panic in America are kind of different. I think there's a convergence here. One of them, I think, relied on this like extensive progressive transphobia wing. In America, this layer has been largely doesn't exist, but is also largely unnecessary because of the raw power of the theocratic bloc in American politics. I think that, you know, the on I think that we need to organize very decisively, very consistently around the very simple premise that people should be free to live their lives. And I include in this young people, the questions of like, oh, what about teenagers, etc. Um, what about youth? That I do really, of course, that they should have access to psychological support, etc. But I very strongly reject this idea of that we need more doctors sniffing around telling children what to do, telling teenagers what to do. That we need more parental controls. That we need more controls from these institutions. In fact, we should say the young people should have the ability to determine their destiny as well. That's what we in the RCO said after the Supreme Court decision, and attempts to limit access to youth healthcare here, and that's what we say. It's what we say about teenagers who seek abortions. It's what we say about teenagers who seek contraception. Leave the kids alone, and let's open the way for human freedom. That's what I've got to say. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Roxy. We're glad we got to hear you in the end. Comrades, we'll be back at 1:30 for Ian Wright on the macro dynamics of the law of value.